in the Mediterranean, little kids, the 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds, and they just know all the mushrooms, because like their grandparents teach them. And so it's this weird contrast that in Europe, even kids learn the mushrooms and it's no big deal. Nobody is freaking out. But then in America, so many people are freaking out. There's only 100 or so that we know will make you sick or die. And there's like 200 or 300 that we know that are worth eating out of 10,000. So it's a very slim pickings on both sides. But the ones that we know will make you sick or die taste good. Warning, it's gonna taste good. It's gonna smell good, but that's not a reason to eat it. Theoretically, we could just hoover our way through the whole continent, gather every fruit of every mushroom. This isn't possible, but theoretically we could do that, and it would not hurt the population of the fungus itself that's living underground or inside trees.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast, with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode featuring
Frank Hyman has spent decades on a quest to find his calling and figure out how to make a living from them. He discovered foraging for mushrooms, and Frank has taught foraging to over 1,000 chefs, organic farmers, arborists, and everyday people. His newest exploration is in publishing his book, How to Forage Mushrooms Without Dying, identifying 29 edible wild mushrooms. I am so excited, Frank, to interview today. And I always start with my first question is, what is your current mantra or state of mind?
Right now, I'm relaxed. I'm out on the screen porch I built. It's beautiful September weather, and I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I mean, I always like being around nature. It's important for you, especially for your degrees and what you've gone through. But also, what is the thing that caused you to do horticulture?
Ever since I was like about 13, at that point in my life, I was a very unpopular, overweight bookworm. But my mother got me a paper route, and I learned from that, like, wow, when I'm outdoors, I am so much happier. When I am moving my body, I am so much happier. When I am biking along with a bunch of dogs, that people used to let dogs loose in those days. And like when I'm riding around with my little dog pack, I am so much happier. And I'm gonna figure out how to, and over the years, I realized when you learn you have to have a job and they want you to have a career and all these things. I'm like, I have to be outdoors. I have to be moving around. I have to be having a good time. And if I'm not doing those things, I will have failed myself, much less letting down the people in our lives. Because when we're not happy, it's hard to make other people happy. And when you are happy, it's easier to make other people happy, right?
True. You identified your values, which took precedence in your career pursuits, because part of people discovering your hardcore values that you need to have as part of your pursuits of work and career. You've done a very good job at identifying your pursuits in the environment that you need to be, happy and enjoy your mood. You went into exploring mushroom foraging. So how did that start for you?
Finding your calling is not an intellectual pursuit. It's not like you look in the course catalog and go like, oh, I need to be an electrical engineer. It's an emotional thing. And it's kind of like when you go to a party and you meet somebody and you have a crush. It's that feeling of a crush. Like, oh, I got to know more about this person, or I have to know more about this topic. And so my wife and I were visiting her family in Maine like 20 years ago. And in the local paper, somebody's got, oh, we're leading a mushroom hike. Come learn the mushrooms, blah, blah, blah. And we both like being outdoors and didn't know anything about mushrooms, but like, sure, let's go. And so we're on this mushroom hike. We're having a good time. We learn some mushrooms. We take some home, cook them and eat them. Like, it's great. But I didn't realize how much the mushroom thing was blowing up at the time, which could explain why when we got home and I'm thinking about it, I'm like, man, Frank, this is great. This is going to be one of your hobbies for sure. But I just don't think I'll ever make a dime from mushrooms. Who cares about mushrooms that much? I just didn't know that this thing was blowing up. And then through some serendipity, I ended up selling, mushrooms to a chef. And started writing columns about it, started taking people on hikes and then doing slideshows and then writing a book. And it was just like, wow. So probably like 15 or 20% of my income is from learning about mushrooms. Of all, what the heck? So myself from 20 years ago, if I'd had a glimmer of today, I would have been like, really? What the hell? Who cares about mushrooms that much? How can this be a thing? But it's a thing.
It's an important thing to find your calling right when it's
Yeah.
the moment that it's, turning that corner. I'm part of a mycology society here in LA. So
Okay.
I'm important for the knowledging of foraging and figuring out which you've already pursued to teach people these skills, because a very poignant book title for you and the way that people have that fear. But I want you to explore a little bit about the history of mushrooms and how you've discovered some things about it.
So many of your listeners, I'm sure, grew up afraid of mushrooms, and perhaps right now they're like, "Oh my God, mushrooms are bad. You can't tell one from the other. Even the experts can't tell them apart." A lot of us have grown up with that, and what that means, if you grew up that way, what it really means is that you grew up in an English-speaking country. It's that simple and bizarre. But my wife and I, when we go on vacation, often we go to the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
And we go to the rural areas. We flee the tourist zone is how I think of it. And I go to places where you meet somebody and they say, "Wow, I've never met an American before." That's how you'll know you're in the right place. And also in rural areas in the Mediterranean, little kids, the 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds, can lead you around and say, "Oh, we don't eat that one. That one's okay. That one's okay. That one's okay. That one's not okay. We don't eat that one." And they just know all the mushrooms, because like their grandparents teach them. And so it's this weird contrast that in Europe, even kids learn the mushrooms and it's no big deal. Nobody is freaking out. But then in America, so many people are freaking out,
Mhm.
about mushrooms. And so I did a little digging and research and found that it kind of goes back to England, kind of creating their separate identity from the continent. They defeated the Spanish Armada with a bunch of rowboats, so they were like, "Oh, we're badasses. We're the smartest people in Europe. And you people on the continent are big dummies because you are eating mushrooms and they could kill you. And you are so dumb and we are so smart." I mean, the English are so invested in their superiority that they even drive on the wrong side of the road just to prove their point, right? Think about this. Yeah, mushrooms, bad. And then the English colonized the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And that's basically where people are afraid of mushrooms. They brought this fear of mushrooms with them.
Mhm.
And everybody else any place in Asia, any place in Africa, any place in South America, the native people are just like, "Oh yeah, we're eating mushrooms. Yum, good." You don't have to catch it. We fry them up, we eat them, they're great. But the English were like, "Oh, scared of mushrooms." So if you were raised to be afraid of mushrooms, it's just because you grew up in an English speaking country. And so because a lot of the mushroom people are into kind of Latin terms. So I'm like, yeah, let's go that way. So I call it Anglophonic mycophobia. So English speaking mushroom fear. Let's all be Latin. Let's speak Latin now. So that's kind of one of the weird things about it, because when I first got into it in the first year, thinking, "Oh, it's going to be really hard to tell them apart." And I learned like a dozen mushrooms without really trying very hard. And I was like, man, none of those were hard to figure out. Like chicken of the woods, like lion's mane, there aren't things that look like that. Colors are very distinct and the shape and everything's very distinct. And so I learned a dozen and it was like easy. And I'm like, wow, that was so easy. And then the next year I learned another dozen and they were all easy. And then I learned a third dozen and like those were none of those were hard. Sometimes I had to pay a little bit of attention.
I had my first experience foraging mushroom, and you touch on this on your book about Finland. And that's where I went because I lived
Yes.
there for a time and I thought it was really interesting what you said. Can you explain a little bit about that?
So part of this thing where the continent of Europe, people are very comfortable with mushrooms. After World War II, in Finland, particularly, food was hard to come by. Agriculture had been messed up all over the continent. And so one of the things the Finnish government did was they hired like, I don't know, like 500, 1,000 Finnish mushroom experts. So
Mm.
some of the most knowledgeable people who are good teachers. And they said, "Hey, we're going to hire you and you are each going to teach like 500 people who will then go out and teach 500 more people which mushrooms are safe to eat, the easy to identify ones. And so they just rolled on with this and taught a lot of people how to identify mushrooms. So people were able to like just go out into the woods behind their house or in their own front yards and find delicious, edible, gourmet mushrooms that they didn't have to pay for. They could add them to a pot of soup. They could fry them up with eggs, anything. And that kids could even learn this. So
Hmm.
it was a major boost for Finland, and a lot of other European countries have a more developed way of teaching people mushrooms. France, for instance, if you're foraging mushrooms and you do because you will come across some you're not sure,
Yeah.
'cause you're not going to know you're not going to know 100% of them out there. But if you find some mushroom, I think this is good to eat, but I'm not sure. You go to the local pharmacy,
Interesting.
and the pharmacists know all the local mushrooms, and they will look at it and go like, yes, this is good. No, this is bad. And then you go home and you're safe and nobody's dying, nobody's getting sick. Yes. So in all the other continents, a well-developed educational system about learning mushrooms. And they're not like freaking out about it. They're not afraid
Yeah.
they're gonna die.
I think it's a good that you have a second set of eyes to check everything when you're in a
Yes.
European country because
Yes.
there's a lot of European history outside. I like that you mentioned a toadstool, and I believe that came from your English background. You want to expand about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the word toadstool, I was a weird kid. So in high school, I was like trying to study German on my own, and which is hard. So I learned a little bit, but not much. But when I was starting to educate myself more about mushrooms, the word toadstool kept coming up, and it always seemed to be that toadstool was associated with poisonous mushrooms, not with like, oh, let's go toadstool hunting and fry them up. Nobody ever said that. And so, like, okay, why is toadstool negative? And then I remembered that one of the words I did learn in German was that tot, Tod, but it's pronounced like the D is pronounced like a T, so tote. Anyway, tote and stool means sitting on the toilet or what comes out of you when you're sitting on a stool, right? We need a stool sample, right?
Mm-hmm.
And half of the English language is German, really,
Mm-hmm.
and the other half is French. So it's like French and German gives you English. And so you can chase some of these words back. If you travel in Germany or France and you look at the billboards or something, you will recognize some of the words.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, death stool. I could imagine German people calling it, the ones who had a fear of mushrooms calling it that, and the English would definitely glom onto that term, you know?
Mm.
And they're and you wouldn't even have to be afraid of mushrooms, just being aware that some will kill you or some will send you running for the toilet.
Makes sense.
Right. Right. So whatever word the Germans had for edible mushrooms, and then they had a word for like not edible mushrooms. You want to stay away from. Oh, toadstool, stay away from the toadstool.
It is a warning in a way that they have
Yeah.
set up. And, English people love to have puns and plays on words
Yes.
consistently. So they're really,
Yes.
I lived in England
Can't
for 10
stop
years.
themselves.
So
Yeah.
it's my local in its own way. But I think it's hilarious that they have the ability to pun and make it truth. But it's like a hybrid of words that I catch
Yeah.
myself doing sometimes.
Yeah.
But, you always guess about mushrooms because who has tried this before me to discover that it's poisonous or deadly?
Right. Which is the thing. It's like the ones that we know are deadly or will make you sick. I differentiate the terms I use is they're either killers or sickeners. Because
Okay.
most books say it's either poisonous or toxic, and I think, well, those are synonyms. How do you remember which is which? So either it's a sickener or it's a killer. And the only reason we know that some are sickeners or killers is because they smelled and tasted good enough that somebody shoveled them down, and then like ran for the toilet, or they, died in a few days. There's only 100 or so that we know will make you sick or die, and there's like 200 or 300 that we know that are worth eating out of 10,000. So it's a very slim pickings on both sides. But the ones that we know will make you sick or die taste good. Warning, it's going to taste good. It's going to smell good, but that's not a reason to eat it.
My father's from Norway. And so
There you
there's a
go.
specific mushroom there that I'm sure you're very familiar with it. And it would be leaning towards the poisonous, I said hallucinogenic side, red and white, and it
Yes.
has a specific name. You want to expand about that?
Yes, of course, you asked me a specific name, and I'm 64, and I can't think of the name. I can think of everything about this mushroom. It's an
I have a hard
Amanita
time remembering it myself, but I always have to remember it starts with an
Amanita muscaria.
Amanita muscara.
Yes, Muscari, and it's the classic. Everybody knows the look of this mushroom, even if you
Mhm.
grew up in an English-speaking country,
Yes.
because it's so charming and cute. It's got a white stalk, it's got a beautiful red cap, and all these little white dots on it, which are called warts, little
Mhm.
scabby little things. And they can be an edible mushroom if you I don't know if anybody's done this, but I read about I think if you boil them like 2 times, you can get rid of the hallucinogens. It's just an edible mushroom. So I'm not recommending anybody do that because it probably takes more than that to really make it safe to
Yeah,
eat.
there's a whole practice behind it that
Yes.
I wouldn't
But
recommend it for, but it's gained a calling here.
yes.
And I've
Yeah.
seen it recently more often, but it has an ancient tradition behind it from the Nordic perspective. And also, it's the colors of Santa.
Like some of the mystics of
Hmm.
the community would dress in red and come down through the smoke hole in the yurt or something.
Yeah,
That that transmogrified into the story of Santa coming down your chimney and wearing red with white trim and bringing joy to the little boys and
there's a
girls.
lot of lineage and history that pairs with
Yes,
each other, but I find it fascinating always. So,
yes.
expanding on identification and how to understand what a mushroom is, there's a multitude of words and phrases. Can you teach the listeners a little bit about how to identify a mushroom in their specific areas?
Yes and no. And by no, I mean there are no general rules. There is just nothing. There were some old rules like, oh, if you're cooking it and you put a silver spoon in the broth, if it comes out black, it's safe to eat, or maybe it's not safe. But either way, it's
Mhm.
just wrong. Any general rule is not good. Going back to what I said, if it smells good, that doesn't help you. If it tastes good, that doesn't help you. So there are no general rules. That's the most important thing. Each mushroom that you will learn, you will have to be ideally introduced to that mushroom by somebody who's somewhat of an expert, the local expert. So when I want to teach a class, it's some times of year there aren't a lot of mushrooms out, or even if it's high season, like in the fall, if it hasn't rained, there's no mushrooms out there. So I had a friend of mine, I saw she had made a model of a mushroom. I said, can you make a bunch of those for me for my classes? And so you have to be introduced to them because it'll be particular details that are easier shown in real life than talked about. I mean, you can learn from photos if they're detailed well enough. But for example, probably one of the most common mistakes people in this country make is this is a model of a chanterelle. And people think they have, and by people, I mean men, will think they have found a chanterelle when they come across this mushroom. Right? It's
Mhm.
like the book on the pictures of the chanterelles. Oh, it's yellowish and blah blah blah. Looks like this, that, and the other. And some guy who really wants to impress another person, and by another person I mean a woman, that he's
Because
like
they're the most
bringing
delicious,
home
right?
food for the little woman.
Mhm.
And a guy will find these. This is
Yes.
called a jack o' lantern because of
Hmm.
the orange, color of like a pumpkin, but also because they glow in the dark. If you find them at their peak, and if you get in a dark,
Bioluminescence.
yes. This is one of the most beautiful things you will see in nature. And I have like 1,000 beautiful things in nature stories. And this is way high up there. You need to be in a dark enough room. There's like no light where your eyes are like hungry
Hmm.
for light, So like go into a closet and then put a towel at the bottom of the closet door, like you did in college.
Hmm.
Um, and if it's you get it at its peak, it will glow in the dark, and it'll be because you'll be looking at the gills, it'll be lit up, it'll be amazing and beautiful. So, but back to the main point, chanterelles are some various shade of yellow,
Hmm.
and jack-o'-lanterns are like this screaming crazy orange, and these are what I call a sickener. They taste smell good, you'll be like, oh, that smells so good, and then you cook it and eat it, like, oh, that tastes so good, and then you're running to the toilet because it's coming out both ways.
It's
And
like food
many people,
poisoning,
I know,
basically. It's
essentially,
my
yes,
least favorite thing of all the.
yes, there you go, right, yes, you understand. And there's other factors too that make it easy to tell the difference. So, like the
Mhm.
inside, chanterelle is white on the inside, and jack-o'-lanterns are the same color on the inside as they're on the outside. So
Mhm.
it's easy to tell, even if you have issues with colors. It's
Yeah.
easy to tell the difference, but you want to be introduced. Ideally, somebody holds them up and says, "This is this, and this is this," and you're off and running, and you're good to go because it's not hard. You don't need a spore print for most of them, so you can identify it right away in the
So
field.
most people won't know what a spore print is.
Ah,
So
yeah,
define what a spore print is and also the dimensions. You're talking about, you mentioned about gills and non-gills. So
yeah.
you want to expand about that so people would understand the difference?
Yeah, real quickly. Most people have probably looked at a mushroom close enough to realize that underneath the cap, there are these parallel gills. They're called gills. They sort of look like gills on a fish, but not really, but close enough. And they are all parallel like railroad tracks. They do not meet. And on a chanterelle, the gills are very shallow. Technically, they're not gills, but we don't need to get into that. But they will cross. They are not parallel. They will cross each other and make X's and Y's and V shapes. And so, yet another easy peasy way to tell chanterelle from jack o' lantern. So, there's no good excuse for like serving this to your family. See, right side by side, like, oh my God, there's nothing alike. Because I've talked to people who had a mushroom ID book, picked these, was sure they were these, and fed this to their family.
Yeah.
So people can make mistakes, but again, by people, I mostly mean men because they want to impress somebody. And by somebody, I mean
Well,
a woman.
chanterelles are very delicious, so I understand your
Yes,
point of view.
they are worth the effort, right? But the
Mhm.
effort is not great. So the way mushrooms reproduce, or the way I think about it, is mushrooms in the field are similar to plants, in
Mhm.
that plants want to send out pollen and they want to send out seeds to create the next generation. Mushrooms want to send out spores, which is these microscopic, dusty little things that come out of their gills. And those spores create the next generation. So when you find a mushroom and maybe you're not sure what it is, or you're just an artful person, you can take them home, cut off the stalk, STALK, the stalk, and just leave the cap and set the cap down on a piece of paper or cardboard or newspaper, anything. And overnight, the spores will drop down. And when you take the cap off, it'll be this beautiful print, like an X-ray, a fingerprint of the cap. It's very beautiful. The colors will be amazing. The view, it's one of the most beautiful things, and it's worth doing. And you will run across some mushrooms where A mushroom looks kind of like B, but to be really sure, you want to get the spore print, which might be white or pink or brown or green, other colors. So the spore print for a small number of edible mushrooms will be important, but 90% of the mushrooms you're going to be chasing down, you can identify them in the field without the spore print. But do some spore prints. It's fun. It's beautiful. It's a great thing for kids. Kids will love it. And it's just easy thing to do. So
It's important to identify because spores relate, pollen. They have the
yeah,
same factors, but very different, and they're useful to understand like what they look like. Because if you're going to eat it, you want to explore it first before you ingest it. So,
you're right.
explain. You touched on this in your book about the idea of describing mushrooms comparatively, because you said plants before, they are kind of a plant, but also you went to explore it as an animal. You want to describe what you mean by the
Yes.
similarities?
So this is not a scientific analysis, but it's a practical analysis. So there's the animal kingdom,
Mhm.
right? We all can think of creatures that belong in that. And there's the plant kingdom, and we can all think of plants that belong in that. Mushrooms are neither one of those things. They are their own kingdom. Scientists used to consider them a type of plant just because they just didn't know what they were. And then when scientists got enough knowledge to separate them, the three out, they say, okay, mushrooms, fungi are in their own kingdom. At a physiological level, they are more similar to animals than they are to plants. But let's not get into that. That's too complicated. But in a practical sense, for you out in the field and in the kitchen, this is one good way to think about it. Out in the field, mushrooms act like plants, like putting out the spores to create the next generation that are floating on the wind. And the part we eat is actually considered, the term we use is fruit. So the body of the mushroom, or if it was a plant, the part that's like the roots and the trunk and the branches is actually underground or inside a tree, and it's decomposing organic matter, gathering water, whatever. And the part that we see and eat is actually the fruit. Instead of having seeds and or pollen, it has spores.
Hmm.
And so we can gather, theoretically, we could just hoover our way through the whole continent, gather every fruit of every mushroom. This isn't possible, but theoretically, we could do that, and it
Hmm.
would not hurt the population of the fungus itself that's living underground or inside trees, right? So out in the wild, mushrooms act like plants.
Hmm.
In the kitchen, do not treat it like a plant. You can leave a bunch of carrots on the counter overnight and you're not going to poison yourself with bacteria. But if you leave meat on the counter overnight, or you leave meat in the in a bag in the back seat of a hot car all afternoon, you have you have got a little bacteria experiment going on, because mushrooms have a high protein level. And so in the kitchen, they act like, you want to treat them like meat. You want to keep them cool. You don't want to leave them in a hot car. When you bring them home, you want to roll them up in a paper bag and put them in the fridge. If you're not going to eat them right away, you don't want to seal them up in a plastic bag, because the fruit that you've harvested is still alive and still transpiring moisture. And so the inside of the bag will be very damp, and whatever, tiny population of bacteria is on that mushroom that normally wouldn't bother you, but once it's closed up in a plastic bag and lots of moisture, the population explodes to a level that could make people sick. So could treat it like, once you gather it and you're in the car or you're at home, treat it like a piece of meat, like, oh, we have to keep this cool. Put up in a paper bag so it can breathe a little bit. That won't hurt it at all.
I think I learned something from you as well in your book, kind of mentioning about the heat and also when you buy mushrooms at a store and the washing factor. You want to explain a little bit about the raw mushrooms rather than the cooked mushrooms?
Yes. So the most common mushroom that people have been able to buy over the last 100, 200 years is the button mushroom. Like you get at the grocery store, or like it's sliced up at the salad bar, and it's raw.
Hmm.
And those you can safely eat raw, as long as they've been kept cool so they're not covered with bacteria, which you can't count on that, but because they don't have a toxin in them that would make you sick. Most mushrooms that are edible, morels, chanterelles, black trumpet, lion's mane, chicken of the woods, they have toxins in them that if you
Hmm.
ate them raw, yeah, it'd be coming out both ways. You would be running to the toilet. And so that's why, as a general rule for novices, I say, you got mushrooms, you should cook them like 10 or 15 minutes, so you can denature the toxins that are in that morel or in that chanterelle, and then
Hmm.
they're safe to eat. And 10 or 15 minutes is not too long to cook mushrooms. Their fibers are different. So if you cook vegetables or fruit too long, they just get mushy.
Hmm.
But I grew up in the South, so that's just kind of how we cook them here.
Yeah.
And if you overcook meat, it gets dry and tough,
Yeah.
right? But you can overcook mushrooms and it does not hurt them, because they have, part of their physiology is that they have chitin, which, this is going to sound gross, but chitin is what our nails and our hair is made of.
Hmm.
Of course, are not edible, but chitin in mushrooms is edible. And so if you cook them for a long time to eliminate the toxins, that's okay. You're not going to ruin their texture.
Sense a way that you need to be aware of certain perspectives of having mushrooms either from a store. I mean, we'll go back to the idea of I've used mushrooms as a meat substitute. Portobello mushrooms is a prime example of using it as a burger meat alternative for people that are
Yes.
vegetarian or something like that, but also washing them. And I was cooking those. But when you go into a salad, in the or perspective of putting something in the salad, you would normally use button mushrooms from my experience. Cook them or then add them, or what do you think about that?
What I would say is, as a general rule, cook them, because even like button mushrooms and things like that, and portobellos, which I recommend cooking them anyway, because so when you buy mushrooms at the store and they're in a container, and they've got like a plastic wrap over the top, and where the mushroom is touching the plastic wrap, there's like kind of a
Mhm.
flat brown spot.
Yeah.
That's bacteria. So for novices, wild mushrooms, cook it. And don't be afraid to cook the hell out of it because you won't hurt the texture. So, yes, in terms of washing them, people and lots of chefs, I still see this in cookbooks on mushrooms coming out now. They say, oh, don't wash them too long, they'll get soggy. And it's like, no, that never happens. And Harold McGee, who is like the dominant cookbook maestro scientist guy, Harold McGee, he looked into this and he said, no, mushrooms are not absorbing moisture from water landing on top of them. They absorb moisture from the mycelium underneath them. But you
Hmm.
could wash them under the faucet. You won't hurt them a bit. So go ahead and wash them. Don't do the tedious thing like my wife did when she worked in a fine restaurant. She had to like, take a paper towel and like scrape every little bit of dirt or whatever. Look at the faucet. Psh, fine. Won't hurt them a bit. You don't have to worry about drying them off. Don't do that. You don't need to do that. Here's the one thing that I learned about from a great mushroom hunter, Alan Muscat in Asheville. His website is notastelikehome.com, worth checking out. And I forget who he learned this from, but the way to make mushrooms really give them that meaty texture and to caramelize them is after you wash them and you hand shred them to bite-sized pieces or you dice them up, whatever you do, then you want to throw them in a hot pan without fat.
Hmm.
And you did not hear that wrong. You want like a hot pan, cast iron is
Cast
best with
iron. Yeah.
surface. And then you want a spatula. It's a metal spatula with a straight edge, not these rubbery ones or rounded ones. And so you've washed your mushrooms, you've cut them up, and then you throw them in a pan on medium high heat, and immediately you start pushing them around with a spatula so they don't stick
Mm.
immediately. And it's not a thing to do while you're watching kids because you need to focus for a couple minutes
It's
on that.
very Julia Child. Don't crowd the
Yeah,
mushrooms.
right. And just keep pushing them around in a dry pan so they don't stick, and a big cloud of steam will come off.
Mm-hmm.
So for about 2 minutes, you have this cloud of steam, cloud of steam, cloud of steam. You're shoving, push them around, focused. And you will notice, after a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, something I don't really count it, but something like that, you notice that your cloud of steam, the volume of it will shrink down by like 80%. It'll be a sudden thing. And then you throw your butter in there or your olive oil, or if you're a southern boy like me, you throw in a big pat of bacon fat. Yum. And that melts, and then you're cooking them. So you've driven off like 80% of the moisture in these
Mm.
mushrooms. And then they will caramelize because if you just throw them into some hot fat, the moisture's coming out and they're just boiling in their own juices, which is
Mm.
get that mushy texture that some people don't like. My
Make-
wife doesn't like them. But if you do, it's called a dry saute. You can look it up. Some cookbooks have it, others don't. I drive off the moisture first, then add the fat, and you can brown the mushrooms and you get more of that meaty texture.
mm.
Try that with your portobellos next time. It'll take it to a whole nother level. Wow. Yes. If people only remember one thing, it's the dry saute. It will change your life. All the people in your life who are like, oh yeah, I don't like mushrooms. They're mushy. It's serve them these mushrooms and you will change their life.
Yeah.
Yes.
I
Guaranteed.
think it's important to understand how to cook them well. In my mind, I remember having like chickens, and you would go get the chickens and you didn't want to wash them until you're going to use it. You wanted to keep that bacteria around the
Yes.
egg because they last longer that way.
Yes.
And in mushrooms, when you're washing it, do you think you need to do it at point of use or
Yes.
before?
You're totally right. Yes. So when you've gathered the mushrooms, whether you're buying them at a farmer's market or you're finding them in the field, whatever, put them in a paper bag, roll up the end, put it in the fridge. You can put it in the crisper section, just to, let the moisture come out. And then when you're ready to cook, you're right. That's when you wash them, right before you put them in the pan. So
Yeah.
you'll get much better results that way.
I think just washing them in general after you buy them and putting them back in the fridge will probably increase the moisture levels in the bacteria.
Bingo. You are totally right. Yes.
So I
Yes.
would be like not recommending to wash it right away when you get them, but use them and
Yes.
wash them when you're at the point of you want to use them to cook something.
Yeah, they'll be fine in the fridge without being washed. That won't hurt them a bit.
The book does a really good, clear interpretation of what they look like. And you touch on smell as a very prime thing. And you spoke about it before in this timeline that you were saying that it smells good, probably tastes good, but it's not good for you. But
Yeah.
it can. And you were saying it in a way, it sounds like fromage. It sounds like cheese. Like the stinkier, the better.
Yeah. Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I agree with you on the cheese, though.
Yeah,
Yes.
in the cheese. I'm not on the cheese, but the mushrooms. Do you think
Yeah.
like?
In a nutshell, my point is that the how a mushroom smells has nothing to do with whether it's edible. It has nothing, and it shouldn't be used as an ID characteristic. A lot
Mhm.
of people will insist to you. A lot of foragers will, at all levels, skill levels, will insist to you that chanterelles always smell like apricots, and that's how you can tell if it's a chanterelle. And I'm like, and I remember at the beginning, I'm a horticulturist. I know what and I would apricots smell like, and I'd get this chanterelle, and I'd be like looking for that apricot smell, and it would be to me like a mushroom smell.
Mm,
So and so but I would keep that to myself because a lot of experts are so insistent on this point.
yeah.
And then as I got a little more into it, I'd be chatting with somebody. I'd say, "Hey, they never smelled like apricots to me," and they go, "Look, me neither. What is that about?" And so I found lots of people are intimidated by the experts who
Hmm.
insist that it smells like an apricot, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But here's the key thing:
Mm.
is there's a book I can recommend called "Of Mushrooms and Morning," Mourning.
The morning being death.
Yeah. So it's written by an Indonesian woman who married a Norwegian guy. He died in his early 50s. Totally
Okay.
sad story. And they had planned on taking a mushroom class together. And then he
Okay.
died. So she went to the mushroom class just to get out of the house and was lit. She found one of her callings, unexpected. And she's written this great book about mushroom foraging, but also how it helped being that the mushroom hunting kind of pulled her out of her own head. So she had a break from mourning her husband, which is
Hmm.
the challenge for everybody who has, a close person die. Is like, can I have a break from this grief?
Yeah.
So one of her points in the book is the point I've been had tried to make to a smaller audience, that the smell of mushrooms will depend on it depends on your gender. It
Mm.
depends on what
Like a
kind of
perfume.
medication you might be on. It
Yeah.
depends on whether you're pregnant or not, what the mushroom smells like. Because in Norway, they did this big study where they had like, during high season, they had like, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 mushrooms out, and they ran a bunch of experts and middle of the road people and novices by, and they said, mushroom A, write down what it smells like to you. And the
Mhm.
smells were all over the map.
Wow.
So this is a lovely book. The writing is great. The story is excellent. Every time somebody I know loses a close family member, I give them a copy of this book, and they tell me,
Yeah.
Frank, I love this person. The story helped me a lot. So matsutake is this mushroom that the Asian folks just love.
Mhm.
This it's also in this continent. Often when people find matsutake, they saute it up and they eat it like, oh, it's kind of. She figured out that the matsutake tastes great if you boil it,
Interesting.
but not if you saute it in dairy products like butter or oil, because its flavors are kind of water based and
Mm.
other flavors of other mushrooms are like oil based.
Okay.
This is an amazing book that deserves wide readership among people interested in mushrooms. She gets down to the nuts and bolts and gets a little break from grief over her husband. It's a powerful book. So
Sometimes
anyway,
connecting with nature is important for you in your process of
yes,
finding your new purpose after a loss, something like that. So
yes,
it,
yes.
it's also amazing that my father always says, no matter how you're feeling, food will be your solace that will bring you up.
I
So,
like your dad.
well, he's all about like, you having a bad day, kid? You want some food? Like,
That makes
it's
it
not
different.
like overeating is just like, sometimes you don't want to cook it for yourself, and it's nice to have
True,
someone else do it or,
true. To feel
have
taken
that
care of.
addition.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, we gotta remember. I think the education system helps people causes people to forget that our brains are trapped inside our bodies, and when our bodies aren't happy, nobody's happy. Right? Does that make sense? Yes. So
It
what your dad's saying
makes
makes a lot of sense.
a lot of sense. But also, I understand that for me, I get hangry and not a pleasant person.
Ah,
Angry is an issue. Like, I can't process anything that you're telling to me if I'm hungry. I'm like, yes, kind
yes.
of. Don't know.
Yes.
Didn't hear you at all. Like, still,
Yeah.
I'm smiling and nodding to get through this. And I was like,
Yes.
nothing has processed and nothing has sunk in. And I wanted you to explain about, I don't know if you're on it yourself, because we had a joking conversation before this. Have you tried lion's mane, and what's your takeaway from using or cooking that?
I love lion's mane. I got the first time I made money from mushrooms was somebody clued me into a 33-pound lion's mane growing on a tree, and I told him, if you tell me where it is, gather it, I'll split it with you. And he said he was grossed out by mushrooms. He says, no, 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 I'll tell you where it is. You can keep the whole damn thing. So I scoped it out and went back home. I had to go out into the woods with an 8-foot step ladder, and I had to stand on the top part, which is flat, but it says "Do
Mhm.
not stand here," which that's like a mixed message. But that's how high I
Yeah.
had to like cut this thing out. So yeah, lion's mane has played a big role in my life. I love the texture of it, but all I know about lion's mane is that it is recommended. There are people who feel like it has anti-cancer
Hmm.
properties. It was mentioned in one of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novels about life in the Russian Gulag, and so a lot of people use it as a anti-cancer or a cancer preventative. It's also, I've read that it helps your brain. It reduces the decline in your brain power as you age. But that's all I know about. I've given you everything I know about lion's mane in terms of health. You probably know more than I do, but I want to share one other cool ass thing
Hmm.
about lion's mane, because when people do this, they will bust their gut laughing. I guarantee it. So often you're out in the woods, it's mostly in the cool part of the year, and you find a lion's mane growing on a tree, and you get up there. Maybe it's close enough to the ground. I've harvested them like chest high sometimes, but you get a ladder or whatever, or you shoot it out of the tree with a crossbow. I know people that do that, and you take it home.
Hmm.
And often when you harvest it, it is so full of water because the
Mm.
tree is full of water because it's been raining. You'll harvest it, and free water is coming out of the lion's mane and running down your arms. Not a
Mm.
problem. Just telling you, this thing is super saturated with water. So you bring it home, and you're like, God, I know I can do a dry saute and but can I get rid of some of this moisture quicker than that? It's like, yes. So you hold it over the sink. However big it might be this big, it
Yeah.
might be this big. You hold it over the sink, and you put a bowl in the sink, and you take the lion's mane and you twist it as if it were a sponge.
Hmm.
And all this free water comes out of it, which you want to save it. It's got mushroom flavor. Add it to a soup or cook your rice in it, something. And all this water is pouring out of it all over your hands, which is funny enough. And then when you let go, it goes back to its original shape, just like a sponge. Any other mushroom would just kind of crumble and
Yeah,
tear apart,
crumble.
right? Lion's mane is like a sponge. So much water comes out, and then it goes back to its original shape, and you're like, "Holy, honey, come look at this!" So yeah, next time you come across some mushrooms, I mean, probably if you buy some that's been grown at a farm, it may not be that sad. It might have enough moisture to let you do that, but it's worth trying in any condition you get it in. But yeah, lion's mane is such a cool ass mushroom. Oh my god,
It's
it's
a weird little look of a mushroom for
yes,
most people, in a way that it's now I can find it at a grocery store, which I haven't been able to find
yes.
it before. And so recently it's kind of popping up. And I had my first interpretation of actually cooking it and using it. I had no idea what to
Ooh,
do with it.
ooh,
And
tell
I
me.
had no idea like how it tasted, because I didn't do like, try something like a chef, you would try it and you're like, oh, what do we do
Right,
with this? And I
right.
was like, I didn't feel comfortable trying it raw. And I was like, I'm just going to put it in something like maybe a sauce or something. And
Yeah.
it was an interesting taste in general that I wouldn't expect. And I still am trying to figure out what kind of recipes to do with it.
Can I
Yeah.
suggest one?
Yes.
So almost every forager I know or have ever talked with about lion's mane, they all say their favorite recipe with lion's mane is to, so squeeze it out, get the moisture out, and then hand shred it. So it's like bite-sized pieces that look like blue crab meat or any kind of crab meat. And then just get any recipe for making crab cakes
Interesting.
and use it instead of crab. Make a little patty, two, three, four, five, 10 patties, and then you saute it in butter. And you've already got most of the moisture out by just squeezing it. That'll do most of it. Some people say lion's mane tastes like crab or lobster. I don't think. I think that's more of like a what's the word when you look at something and you think it's going to taste a certain way, and so your brain says, "Oh, it tastes that way."
Yeah.
I just think it's like another variant of mushroom flavor, which is fine. But the texture of it and the look in the crab cake, and you've eaten crab cakes, and your
Hmm.
mind is like, oh, that's gonna taste like a crab cake. And you eat it, and it's like, ah, it tastes like a crab cake. The other little thing quickly is that when you first get the lion's mane, whether you find it or you get it at the farmer's market, whatever, I like using a bread knife and shave the whiskers off. But there's all these little whiskers that might be, like as long as that part of my pinky, like a
Yeah.
half inch to inch long, and
Okay.
just shave them off, just like slice them till they all like pop off, and you'll have like a double handful, or however much of all these little whiskers, like little pastas,
Huh.
and saute those in butter, garlic, parsley, blah blah, whatever, and I serve that as like a little pasta side dish,
Hmm.
whatever
Interesting.
else we're eating. Yeah, so that's a fun way to do it. Yeah, lion's mane, super fun in so many ways, crazy fun.
It
Yes.
is it is unusual, but I'm thinking like you were talking about your tree and collecting it. It reminded me of mistletoe. But it's most people don't know mistletoe is a fungus that's infecting an oak tree that we take it off as part of keeping the tree alive. But mushrooms and trees in nature have a different reciprocity, a different like exchange method.
Yes.
And that's I think where it's kind of a different collaboration and sometimes not. What do you think?
Well, there's three broad families of mushrooms. So the most common one, the ones that we can buy, like at the farmer's market or the store, that somebody can grow, are getting like oysters, shiitake, lion's mane, yeah, whatever else I can't think of it right now. But all those that you can buy are a group that most mycologists would call saprobes, which I'm kind of like, okay, most people aren't speaking Latin anymore.
No.
So
Hard.
I said, I'm going to coin terms that are practical, that in the field make sense. And you don't have to be a Latin person to know that saprobe means that it is living off of dead organic matter. So I call all those ones that are growing on a tree, or, growing at a farm on dead wood, or growing on sawdust. I call them eaters of the dead. Ugh. So who's going to forget that? Nobody's going to
Well,
forget
I
that.
mean that would work. It sounds like crows or vultures.
Yeah, and that's what they're doing. They are eating so all organic matter used to be a live plant or mushroom or animal, right?
Mhm.
All organic matter was something alive. And then when it dies, you have this organic matter, and plants, like you add compost to your vegetable garden because plants gain some sustenance from organic matter. And these mushrooms, the eaters of the dead, are growing on a tree that may be live or dead, because some part of the tree is dead. So even if it's a live tree, the heartwood is dead cells, and it's living off of that. And that's why sometimes you find a tree that's hollow
Uh-huh.
and it's still alive. Some mushroom has eaten the heartwood, which are all
Interesting.
dead cells. Yeah. So they're eaters of the dead, but they can also live off of sawdust, which a lot of mushroom growers, they're using sawdust or other, or old coffee grounds. Mushrooms can live off. I've grown oyster mushrooms off coffee grounds, spent coffee grounds. So they're eaters of the dead. So that's one family. Those are the kind that can be farmed.
Mm.
There's another kind that also lives off of trees, but instead of eating the dead part, they eat the live part.
Mm.
Yuck. And I call them assassins. And there's few in number, but there's some honey mushrooms, and they're named that for the color, not their flavor. Some honey mushrooms are assassins, but it's a small number of species. Another big group of types of mushroom is the mycelium, the body of the mushroom, the roots, branch, trunk of the mushroom that's underground, actually, is collaborating with tree roots.
Yes.
And the Latin name is mycorrhizal, but who knows what that means and who can remember that word? So I call them the marrying kind, because
Mm.
that is almost literally what they're doing. So their mycelium is collaborating with the tree roots, and the tree, which does photosynthesis, which is this crazy magical thing, like, oh, shine some light on me and I'll invent sugar, and the sugar goes down into the roots and it shares the sugar with the mycelium, because
Mm.
mycelium can't produce its own sugar. And the mycelium is better at extracting nutrients from the soil. It has more of a magnetic effect and can pull nutrients out of the soil that the tree roots can't get. So that's what it shares with the tree. And so those are morels, chanterelles, black trumpet, the boletes. But I think of them as those three types. Either they're living off of dead organic matter and you can farm them, you can grow them in your kitchen, or they're assassins, and that's kind of sad. or they're the marrying kind and they're collaborating underground, and those cannot be. Nobody has figured out how to cultivate those as a crop. It's just either they're on your trees or they're not.
It makes sense that in a way that is a collaborative and non-collaborative affair between mushrooms and their outside spaces and connections. But one advice for sustainability while foraging.
The first thing is don't do what I've seen some mushroom hunters do. I've gone out with some people, and everybody's a nice person.
Mhm.
And I've gone out with some people, and we'll see some chanterelles or some other species, doesn't matter. And I would say, so there's a patch of chanterelles. There's
Mhm.
going to be some tiny ones, or in the South we say T90, little ones,
Mhm.
and that are like hardly worth picking up. And then there's some that are like mature size that are going to make a good meal, and those are the ones I like to get. And then there's some that are old, that are good size, but they're old and they're like full of bugs and they're just crumbling apart. So the middle of those three. You leave the crumbling ones for the insects to live off of. Leave the tiny ones for whoever comes foraging tomorrow or the next day. Let them gather those, right?
Mhm.
Or let them get big enough that they put out spores, because when they're small, they haven't put out spores yet.
Yeah.
But some people get into mushrooming and this kind of, I hate it, greedy is almost too strong a word, but covetous.
Mm.
They will pick every chanterelle they can see. And so that would be, I think, in a small, very small way, is not sustainable, because the tiny ones haven't put out spores. They're hardly big enough to be worth the trouble of picking them up. The older ones are still putting out spores, and they're a food source for insects. And insects are important because they become a food source for birds and toads and turtles and all these other things. So one the sustainability issue that any forager can do is like just pick the ones that are in their prime, leave the old ones, leave the young ones. And that's easy to do, doesn't cost you anything, and you can pat yourself on the back. I'm saving the earth right here, right now, by letting these other living creatures reproduce themselves and support other and feed other creatures. So that'd be the
Amazing.
most valuable thing I think people can do in terms of sustainability for mushrooms.
Well, it also answered kind of one question that I always ask. I have two finishing questions for everyone, and one is
Oh,
what is the best advice have you ever received?
on anything?
Anything perspective, which one is the first thing that comes to mind? I always say
Oh
that.
my God. When I first went to college, I chose a school that had been a formerly all girls school. So it was, then they'd switched. So it was still 2-to-1 women to men. I don't know why I chose that, but I did.
You're
And I had my suite mate. So I shared a bathroom with a guy in the next room, and he was an older student. So I was 19,
mhm.
18, 19. He was 27. He dropped out, went back, which is what I did. And he would start his day. He had brought a little, like a lazy boy rocker to his room, and so he had a cup, and he would make coffee in his room and add a little Irish whiskey, because he was a
Mm,
redheaded Irish boy, and so he'd have Irish coffee in the morning before his 8 or 9 o'clock first class. And he invited me over, and I would have coffee with him. And one time he handed me my mug, and I kind of moved too quickly and spilled a little bit. Not a
mhm.
disaster. And he just has, when you're around somebody and they spill something, what are you going to, most people are going to say, be careful. What are they going to say in response to that? I was being careful.
Defensive.
I was defensive. And then he takes the energy down a notch, and he looks at me and says, being careful means being full of care.
Wow, good.
My life, because I think one of the hazards of being a smart and educated person is that we are too much into our heads, and we're sure that we're right,
Mm.
and we don't exercise enough caution, because we're so smart and we know the answers, right? And so when he said being careful, it was just kind of a semi-meaningless word for a 19
Mhm.
boy, because our frontal lobe hasn't developed,
Yeah,
right? Until
you're
we're
already
25.
pre-wired but not wired.
Right, there you go. Yes. Yeah, or as one writer said, yeah, at that stage, our frontal lobe is like a bunch of unripe bananas. And so I was sure I was being careful, spilling coffee. I'm like, I'm careful. Who you calling? And he's like, being careful means being full of care.
Mm.
Wow.
Deep truth.
So yes, for almost 50 years, that has been like a critical thing for me. Things are going on. I dial it back. I say, okay, Frank, this is time for you to be full of care.
Mm.
Right. Not that I always do that every time, but a lot of times I do. And that has helped me.
Everything that happens kind of re-gears our brain or memories of thoughts. And the last question I always ask is, what is the best things that you have learned from a version of failure or trying that you weren't successful at? And what are your takeaways from that experience?
I ran for political office. I was 27 years old. I ultimately figured things out, and at 32, I wanted to run for city council, so I cut off my ponytail, I borrowed a suit. I was running for a local board that managed farm programs called Soil and Water Conservation District, nonpartisan. I recommend it if you're wanting to be an environmentalist on the ground and make change. That's a place where
Mm.
you can do it. And the first time I ran, I just took it a little, I didn't really do my homework. I didn't take it seriously enough. I was not full of care.
Mm.
And I ran and I figured, oh, yeah, I used to be a farmer. They'll vote for me, blah, blah. And I just didn't do my homework. I didn't know what it was going to take. I didn't know which groups to meet with to get endorsements. But I'm a smart, educated person. I'm going to be right about this. And I learned it taught me a little bit of humility
Mm.
that I had to recognize when I went into an endeavor. And I lost, no surprise. And 2 years later, I ran for that seat again, and I did win. And that gave me a platform to run for city council and cut off my ponytail, all those things, in which I authored the first living wage ordinance in North Carolina. It was only the third one in the country.
Mm.
So I managed to do a lot of things for working people, but I learned my lesson, and that's one of the things I like to tell people is like, don't beat up on yourself when you make a mistake or have a setback. Just treat it as like a one-room schoolhouse where you can learn to do the things that are important to you. Take the lesson. If I'd have been paying more attention, I could have won. And so just take the lesson. I needed to do more research. I needed to talk to more people. I needed to have more allies. And so I learned a lesson from that first loss, which a very public loss. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people have setbacks, and random people aren't reading about it in the paper. So that was a lesson for me is I need to take things like that more seriously, do more research, get more allies. So all my setbacks have been worthwhile.
Mhm.
They all taught me so many things that I could like turn the story around and have successes.
Mhm.
So yeah, great questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. It was a pleasure to hear you today, and I'm excited. Frank Hyman's book that just came out, How to Forage Mushrooms Without Dying, a absolute beginner's guide. If you want to explore and learn about mushrooms, I recommend picking this up. All the notes will be in the bio, so check him out and his own website and his Instagram as well. You can catch up with his excellent classes when he has them. But thank you very much, Frank, for your time today.
And thank you so much. I really enjoyed myself. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.